The evening sun cast golden hues over La Belle Vie, the most prestigious restaurant in the city. Nestled among sleek glass towers and cobblestone streets, it exuded an air of exclusivity, a haven for the city's elite. The soft murmur of conversation blended with the distant trickle of a marble fountain, and the scent of truffle, freshly baked bread, and aged wine danced in the air. Inside, beneath chandeliers dripping with crystal, Victor Harrington sat at the most coveted table in the center of the restaurant. At 70, he was a man who had built an empire with unshakable resolve. His tailored charcoal suit fit him perfectly, every thread woven with quiet power. Silver-streaked hair combed neatly, gold-rimmed glasses resting on the bridge of his nose. He was the embodiment of wealth and control. But tonight, there was something different about him. A slight weariness in his eyes, a hesitation in the way he reached for his menu. Across from him sat Isabella Harrington, his much younger wife. If Victor was power, she was perfection. A woman sculpted by the finest hands, adorned in luxury. Her dark hair, sleek and smooth, cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face that belonged on the cover of a fashion magazine. A diamond bracelet, worth more than most earned in a lifetime, shimmered as she lazily twirled it around her wrist. Her red lips curved into a delicate smile, but her eyes held no warmth. She exuded effortless elegance, yet beneath it, there was something distant, something calculating. Just beyond the restaurant's wrought iron fence, in the shadows where candlelight did not reach, stood Ethan Carter. Small for his age, he had the wary, sharp-eyed look of a boy who had learned the hard way that the world did not care about kids like him. His hoodie, too large for his thin frame, hung loosely over his shoulders, the fabric frayed at the edges. His sneakers, worn down to nearly nothing, barely cushioned his steps as he shifted from foot to foot. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but that was nothing new. Ethan wasn't supposed to be here, not among men in $1,000 suits and women in silk gowns sipping champagne. Yet he remained, watching, scanning. He had learned to be invisible, but tonight his instincts told him to stay. Something was pulling him toward the couple at the center of the restaurant. He wasn't sure why, but something about them didn't sit right. Victor sighed, running a hand over his glass of wine, his fingers tapping lightly against the stem. "You're distracted again," he remarked, his voice smooth yet edged with something sharper. Isabella glanced up from her phone, her smile returning effortlessly. "I'm right here," she cooed, reaching across the table to brush her fingers against his. "You know how much I enjoy these evenings with you." But Ethan, standing beyond the fence, saw something else. He saw the way her fingers curled slightly as she spoke, the way her attention flickered back to her handbag. He had spent years reading people, looking for the ones who wouldn't notice a kid swiping a roll from their plate, the ones who held their wallets too loosely. And right now, his instincts were screaming. Something was wrong. Victor, oblivious, picked up his menu once more, scanning the delicacies listed in gold print. The waiter approached with a polished smile, placing a bowl of steaming soup before him. Ethan's stomach growled. He forced himself to ignore it, because suddenly, his hunger didn't matter anymore. Something was about to happen, and whether he liked it or not, he was the only one who had noticed. The refined murmur of La Belle Vie continued like an elegant symphony. Soft conversation, the occasional clink of crystal against porcelain, the muted footsteps of waiters gliding effortlessly across the marble floor. Outside, the city pulsed with life, but inside these walls, time seemed to slow, cocooned in wealth and privilege. At the heart of it all sat Victor Harrington, a man whose mere presence commanded attention. He held himself with the quiet authority of someone who had built his own empire, someone who was used to having control. Yet tonight, his sharp blue eyes were dull, distracted as they skimmed over his phone. He barely noticed the steaming bowl of soup that had just been placed before him, nor did he sense the weight of the gaze lingering on him from across the table. Isabella Harrington watched her husband closely, her manicured fingers curling around the stem of her wineglass. The candlelight flickered in her emerald eyes, but there was something unreadable beneath their shimmering surface. A secret, a calculation, a plan set in motion. Her smile was effortless, the picture of poise and grace, but if one looked closely, if one truly watched, they would notice the subtle tension in her frame. the way her gaze darted toward his untouched meal just a second too long. From beyond the restaurant's elegant patio, Ethan Carter had been watching, and he noticed everything. Standing just past the iron fence, his hoodie pulled tight around his thin frame, Ethan's sharp brown eyes followed her. Not the way other men in the restaurant did, drawn to her beauty, but with the wary suspicion of someone who had learned to read people to survive. And right now, every instinct in him was screaming. Isabella's hand dipped into her handbag, the movement seamless, almost casual. To anyone else, it was nothing. Perhaps she was adjusting her lipstick, reaching for a compact mirror. But Ethan saw the vial. It was small, delicate, barely the size of her palm, filled with a clear, innocent-looking liquid. He had seen bottles like that before, though never in a place like this. On the streets, people exchanged tiny vials filled with things that could make or break a person. Things that could end a life. She didn't hesitate. With the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment, she twisted the cap open, tilting her wrist ever so slightly. A few drops slid soundlessly into the soup, disappearing instantly into the rich, velvety broth. Ethan's breath hitched. The room hadn't changed. Laughter still drifted from nearby tables. A waiter poured champagne into delicate flutes. The scent of warm truffle and fresh rosemary filled the air. And yet, in that moment, everything felt different. His stomach clenched as he watched Isabella reach for the silver spoon, giving the soup one slow, effortless stir before leaning forward, resting her chin on her delicate hand. "Darling," she murmured, her voice soft, almost affectionate. "You should eat before it gets cold." Victor barely looked up, already lifting his spoon, his focus still lost in whatever message flashed across his phone screen. No. Ethan's hands gripped the cold iron of the fence. His heart pounded against his ribs, the realization crashing into him all at once. He was the only one who had seen it. No one else was paying attention. No one else had noticed. He could walk away right now. Pretend he hadn't seen anything. Pretend this wasn't his problem. But deep down, he knew the truth. If he turned his back now, he would regret it for the rest of his life. Victor's spoon rose, inches from his lips. Ethan had no time left. He had to act. Now. Ethan's heartbeat thundered in his ears. His fingers tightened around the cold iron fence, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Inside the warm, glowing world of La Belle Vie, nothing had changed. Laughter and quiet conversation filled the air. Champagne glasses clinked, and silverware scraped against fine porcelain. The wealthy dined without worry, oblivious to the silent battle unfolding before them. But Ethan knew. He had seen it. The liquid. The way it vanished into the soup without a trace. The way Isabella stirred it in so effortlessly, her face a portrait of perfect calm. And now her husband, Victor Harrington, the man who had built an empire, was about to take his first bite. Ethan's instincts screamed at him. Move. Do something. Now. And before he could talk himself out of it, he did. His legs carried him forward before his mind caught up. He pushed away from the fence, his feet hitting the ground hard as he sprinted toward the restaurant entrance. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He shoved open the grand double doors, nearly colliding with a sharply dressed waiter. Gasps rippled through the room as heads turned toward the ragged street kid who had just burst into their pristine world. Ethan barely noticed them. His focus locked on Victor, who sat mere seconds away from death. "Don't eat that." His voice cracked as it echoed across the restaurant, cutting through the refined murmur like a blade. Everything stopped. Forks clattered against plates. Conversations died mid-sentence. A woman let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her chest. At the center of it all, Victor froze. His spoon hovered just inches from his lips, suspended in midair as his sharp blue eyes snapped up to the boy standing at the edge of his table. A boy who wasn't supposed to be there. Across from him, Isabella went rigid. Her expression shifted in a split second, from mild confusion to cold, calculating rage. "What did you just say?" she demanded, her voice sharper than shattered glass. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to stand tall. His hands trembled, but he clenched them into fists. "You can't eat that," he said, louder this time, his voice steadying. "She put something in your soup. I saw her." The silence that followed was suffocating. Victor's gaze flickered between the boy and his wife, his brows knitting together. "What the hell is this?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, a flicker of something dangerous beneath the surface. Isabella laughed, but it was hollow, brittle. "This is absurd," she scoffed, shaking her head. "He's just a street kid trying to cause trouble. Look at him. He probably wants money." Ethan's fists tightened. "I don't want anything," he shot back. "I just don't want you to die." A ripple of unease spread through the crowd. Whispers started. "Did she really do it? Look at her. She seems nervous. That boy doesn't look like he's lying." Victor studied Isabella now, his eyes narrowing. His grip on the spoon loosened slightly. "Isabella," he said, his voice eerily quiet. "What's going on?" She scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "This is ridiculous, Victor. Are you seriously entertaining this nonsense?" Her eyes darted to the growing number of onlookers. But the damage was done. Doubt had crept in, and Ethan wasn't backing down. "Smell it?" he pressed. "If you don't believe me, just smell it." Victor hesitated. His fingers tightened around the spoon, and slowly, deliberately, he brought it closer. Not to his lips, but to his nose. His nostrils flared. Something was off. And in that moment, he knew. The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Isabella's mask cracked. Her lips curled into a sneer, and her hands gripped the table's edge with a white-knuckled intensity. "Victor," she hissed, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Eat your damn soup and let's go." But Victor didn't move, and neither did Ethan. Because now the whole room was watching, and there was no going back. A thick, suffocating silence fell over La Belle Vie. The once lively restaurant, filled with the murmur of elegant conversation and the clinking of fine china, now felt frozen in time. Every pair of eyes in the room was locked on the scene unfolding at the Harringtons' table, on the powerful man whose spoon still hovered midair, on the poised woman whose carefully crafted facade was beginning to show its first irreparable cracks, and on the ragged boy who had dared to disrupt the illusion of perfection. Ethan Carter felt the weight of all those stares, but he didn't flinch. He had no proof, no hard evidence, no way to force anyone to believe him. All he had was the truth, and that had to be enough. Across from him, Isabella Harrington inhaled sharply, pressing a hand to her chest as though the very accusation had wounded her. She recovered quickly, her lips curving into a delicate but forced smile, her voice taking on a honeyed smoothness. "Victor," she purred, shaking her head in feigned amusement. "Are you really going to listen to this? He's just a street kid. He saw an opportunity to make a scene, maybe get some pity money. That's all this is." Her words were carefully measured, laced with just the right amount of condescension, just enough dismissal to make it seem like she was the rational one, the composed, dignified woman whose dinner had just been rudely interrupted. Ethan could see how she worked. How easy it was for someone like her to lie. But Victor wasn't looking at her. His sharp blue eyes were locked on his wife, studying her in a way that sent something dark flickering across her face. It was a single moment, a crack in her carefully composed mask. And it was enough. "You're lying." Victor's voice was soft, almost contemplative, but it cut through the air like a blade. Isabella stiffened. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice a careful balance between shock and offense. Victor set the spoon down with an almost exaggerated slowness, his gaze never leaving her face. "You haven't asked me if it's true," he said evenly. "You didn't even look at the soup. You went straight to defending yourself." A muscle ticked in Isabella's jaw. "I don't need to entertain accusations from some filthy child." Ethan's fists clenched, but before he could snap back, Victor spoke again, louder this time. "You always hated the idea of waiting, didn't you, Isabella?" His voice was cold now, cutting through the tension like a whip. A murmur spread through the restaurant, whispers, doubt, suspicion. Ethan saw the shift, the way Isabella's fingers twitched, the way her breath quickened just a fraction too much. She was losing control, and she knew it. Her mask snapped. "You don't understand," she hissed suddenly, her voice dropping into something sharp, unfiltered, raw. "I gave you everything, Victor. My youth, my patience. Do you think I was going to wait another 10 years for you to keel over?" The room gasped. Victor went deathly still. For a moment, time felt like it had collapsed in on itself. The air in the restaurant was thick with the realization that something very, very real had just happened. Ethan barely dared to breathe, and then Victor exhaled slowly, his fingers curling into a fist against the tablecloth. "You tried to kill me," he said, and this time there was no question in his voice. Only certainty. Isabella's face paled. You can't prove anything, she whispered, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Victor turned calmly, almost too calmly, to a nearby waiter. Call the police. The words dropped like a gunshot into the stunned silence. Isabella snapped. No. She lunged, her chair scraping violently against the marble floor, her hands reaching for the soup bowl, to knock it over, to destroy the evidence, to erase the truth before it could fully take shape. But she was too slow. Victor caught her wrist mid-motion, his grip like iron. The room erupted into chaos. For a brief moment, time stood still. The elegant world of La Belle Vie, the delicate crystal glasses, the candlelit ambiance, the quiet hum of wealth, had shattered into something raw, something dangerous. Victor Harrington held Isabella's wrist in a crushing grip, his knuckles white, his face unreadable. She had lunged for the bowl, desperate to destroy the evidence, but he had stopped her just in time. The half-empty soup still sat untouched, a silent witness to her betrayal. The tension was thick, electric. No one moved, no one spoke, until Victor did. His voice, once smooth and commanding, now dripped with cold fury. You were going to kill me. It wasn't a question. Isabella's breath came fast and shallow. The mask she had worn so effortlessly, the polished, elegant wife, the devoted partner, was gone. In its place was something darker. Something desperate. Her eyes flickered around the room, searching for a way out, but there was none. She wrenched her wrist free, stepping back as if the distance could somehow save her. Then her lips curled into a sneer. You're pathetic, Victor, she spat, her voice low and venomous. You always were. Do you really think I wanted to spend the rest of my life playing the good wife? Waiting on an old man who only cared about his empire? A stunned hush fell over the restaurant. Gasps, whispers. The illusion had been completely broken now. Victor exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening into a fist. And so you decided to poison me? I decided, Isabella corrected, her chin lifting, to take what was mine. Ethan watched from the side, his pulse hammering. He had known she was dangerous, but this was something else. He had seen a lot growing up on the streets, but nothing had prepared him for watching someone so beautiful, so composed, so seemingly perfect unravel into something monstrous. And then, the wail of sirens cut through the night. Isabella's head snapped toward the entrance. Red and blue lights flashed against the restaurant's glass windows. Her breath hitched. No, this couldn't be happening. Two uniformed officers entered the restaurant, their expressions blank, but their movements sharp. The weight of their presence sent a fresh ripple of tension through the room. A waiter, still visibly shaken, pointed toward the table. His voice wavered. She tried to poison Mr. Harrington. The officers moved instantly. Ma'am, one of them said, stepping forward, please put your hands where we can see them. Isabella's entire body went rigid. No. Her voice trembled, but her eyes burned with defiance. You don't understand? This isn't. The officer reached for her arm, and she snapped. With a feral scream, Isabella jerked away, knocking over a chair as she tried to flee. She shoved past tables, past wide-eyed patrons, her heels skidding against the marble as she bolted toward the exit. For a second she almost made it, but then Victor stepped in front of her. She crashed into his chest with a strangled gasp. He didn't flinch, he didn't even move. His hands stayed at his sides, but the weight of his presence alone was enough to make her stumble back. He shook his head. It's over, Isabella. And then cold metal snapped around her wrists. The officers restrained her, their grip firm, their movements practiced. Let me go, she shrieked, thrashing her breath. You can't do this. Do you know who I am? Do you know who he is? But no one came to her defense. The guests who had once admired her, envied her, wanted to be her, now looked at her with horror. Victor exhaled heavily, his face unreadable as he stepped away, as if distancing himself from a life that had already ended. Ethan stood frozen, his chest heaving. He had done what he could. The rest was out of his hands now. The officers guided Isabella toward the door. She fought, she cursed, she screamed, but in the end, she was gone. The moment Isabella was led away, the tension in La Belle Vie seemed to dissipate, leaving behind an eerie, lingering silence. The once vibrant restaurant, filled with whispered conversations and clinking glasses, now carried a different weight, a heavy realization of how fragile the illusions of wealth and power could be. Victor Harrington stood still, his face unreadable, his grip tightening briefly on the edge of the table before he let out a slow breath. He had built an empire, survived ruthless competitors, and outlasted financial storms. And yet, he had never seen betrayal coming from the one person he had let closest to him. Across from him, Ethan Carter remained where he stood, unsure whether to run or stay. His heart was still racing, his fingers still trembling. He had spent years learning to blend into the background, to go unseen. Yet tonight, for the first time, he had stepped forward. And because of that, a man's life had been saved. Victor turned his gaze toward Ethan, studying the boy with the kind of scrutiny that would have made anyone else shift uncomfortably. But Ethan didn't flinch. Finally, Victor spoke, his voice quieter than before. "You saved my life." Ethan shifted on his feet, shoving his hands into his hoodie pockets. I couldn't let it happen," he muttered. Victor nodded, almost to himself. "Most people would have," he admitted. "They would have looked away, pretended they saw nothing." He exhaled slowly. "But you didn't." For the first time in years, Ethan felt seen. A waiter cautiously stepped forward. "Sir, would you like us to clear your table?" Victor glanced at the untouched bowl of soup, then at his shaking hands. "Yes," he said, his voice steady, though the weight of everything that had just happened was evident in his expression. He turned back to Ethan. "Sit." Ethan hesitated. People like him didn't sit at tables like this. He belonged on the outside, watching from a distance. Victor must have seen the hesitation because he gave a small, knowing smile. "You saved my life. The least I can do is buy you a meal." Ethan swallowed hard before lowering himself into the chair, stiff and uncertain. Victor signaled to a waiter, "Bring him whatever he wants." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but something in Victor's expression stopped him. He wasn't offering out of pity. It wasn't about charity. It was gratitude. A few minutes later, a plate of steaming food was placed before him, the aroma hitting him harder than he expected. He hadn't had a real meal in longer than he could remember. As he picked up the fork, Victor leaned back in his chair, watching him. "Tell me, Ethan, how long have you been out there?" Ethan hesitated, unsure how to answer. He had long since stopped keeping track. "A while," he said finally, voice quiet. Victor nodded slowly, as if piecing something together. Then, without warning, he pulled out his phone and made a call. Ethan tensed. Was he calling the police? Was he about to be thrown back onto the street? But when Victor spoke, his voice was calm. "I need a favor. There's a boy here. He needs a place to stay." Ethan's grip tightened around his fork. His throat felt dry. Victor hung up, setting the phone down. "You don't owe me anything," he said simply, "but if you want help, it's there." For a moment, Ethan didn't know how to respond. He had spent so long expecting nothing from anyone, so long believing he had to survive alone. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to anymore. The restaurant began to return to normal, the patrons slowly resuming their meals, their conversations. But the weight of what had happened still lingered, a reminder of how quickly life could change. And at one table in the center of it all, a boy who had always been overlooked, and a man who had once believed himself untouchable sat across from each other, two lives forever changed by a single moment of courage. A lesson for us all. Courage isn't always loud. It doesn't always come from those in power or from those who have everything to lose. Sometimes it comes from the people we least expect. And sometimes one small act of bravery can change everything. So let me ask you, what would you have done in Ethan's place? Would you have spoken up, knowing no one might believe you? Or would you have walked away, hoping someone else would? Let me know in the comments. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, hit that subscribe button. Because in this world, the smallest voices can make the biggest impact. Follow for more stories that remind us all. Sometimes, the right thing isn't the easy thing, but it's always worth it.